For the table base, we relied mostly on mortise and tenon joinery. We're going to shift the dovetails for the drawer. Half blinds on the front, through dovetails in the back. I begin sizing my components first with the drawer front. The other ones are pretty much dependent upon that. I've left about a heavy 16th for expansion and contraction. Now I want to fit it lengthwise. I start by squaring an end. A fresh fence reduces tear out and provides a positive indicator. Fit the drawer front in the opening and mark the length. Then make the second cut. It might take a few times to get it just right. That's going to be a really pretty drawer front. Now let's do the dovetails. So I've gone ahead and sized my other drawer components. And I've made a layout that I pulled off of the drawing. Then I'll transfer that to my sides and go ahead and cut my dovetails. In this case, I'll be cutting them on the table saw. For these drawers, I've decided to use some quarter sawn beech that I have. Based on tear out, I assess what will be the inside. Then mark the bottom with a crayon to tell me where the groove's going to go. I set my marking gauge to the thickness of the stock, just a hair heavy, and then mark the front and back of the sides, inside and out. To set my saw, I'm going to mark a setup piece as well. I want to clearly mark that as extra. This little mark helps clarify. It's top front. Working from the outside in, I set my combo square to the first set of lines and transfer them to the stock. Repeat this process for all your layout lines. I only mark one piece, however. So now let's go to the saw and cut these. I'm using a blade that was especially ground for cutting dovetails. All of the teeth are ground 10 degrees in one direction. Tilt the blade to 10 degrees. That way the tip is parallel to the saw table. I use a heavy piece of poplar for my push block, sliding straight in, pulling straight back. On my test piece, I dial in the height. The cut should go exactly to the scribe lines. Set the fence to cut at the pencil line, and then double up the stock, cutting both at once. Because the front tails are symmetrical, I can cut, flip, and cut again until the whole front's completely cut. The process would be much more tedious using a miter gauge with a fence. But still, always maintain tight control of the block. Because the back has a bottom sliding in, the pattern's not symmetrical. I set up individually for those cuts. I always cut a shoulder on the inside of my dovetails. It makes line up and appearance just so much better. I use a rip blade and a tenoning jig to cut a shoulder on the inside of my dovetails. Take it exactly to the scribe line. I do this to help transfer my marks, and it looks better on the inside. Use a scroll saw to cut away the waste. I use my test piece as a fence for the end cuts. To start out, my sides are the same width as my front, but I need to leave room for expansion and contraction so they don't bind. So I'm going to take 1/8 of an inch off the top. Having done that, I can now determine the width of my back. I'll go ahead and cut it now. Now that my tails are complete, I'll work on the pins. Because we cut that notch, we have to reset our marking gauge. And because I'll need it later, I'm going to mark the back of the front too. Next, clearly mark the top inside with a crayon. Place the side in the notch onto the back. Mark one side of the pin, wiggle it over to cover that line, then mark the next. This will give me a nice tight fit. Transfer the scribe lines down the sides. I use the scroll saw to excavate the waist. I begin with the narrow side up, that's important, and cut back to my line. Then turn the piece over, come in, pivot the piece 90 degrees, and cut to the line again. In case there's any tear out, now it'll be on the inside. Back at the bench, pair to your lines. Test your fit, make sure it looks good, do the other side. With the back of the drawer complete, let's move on to the half blinds in the front. Clamp the drawer front to the same routing fixture that we used earlier. Mark the tails, one side and across the top, little wiggle, the other side. A quick indent with my marking knife helps start out the saw. Using a handsaw, cut to the lines. After setting the depth, clean out the sockets with a router, and then pair to your line using a chisel. Having cut all my dovetails, I'm going to do a quick dry fit to make sure the sides and the front are all flush. These look pretty good, so now I'll set up a dado head and cut a groove to fit the bottom. To cut the groove, we use a 1/4 inch dado setup. Adjust the fence so that the top of the groove lines up the top of the notch in back. Cut the grooves in the sides now. So that the drawer bottom can expand, I cut the groove deeper in the drawer front.